Hey everyone, welcome to New School Drug Ed. My name is Kriya Lenzion, and this is the first of a two-part series called Not My Kid, which is wonderfully being brought to you by Principal Meg Turner and the awesome folks at Owen High School, as well as a grant from the local Kiwanis here in Western North Carolina. So I'm going to be talking with you today about substance use trends among youth. This is locally, nationally, internationally, as well as the impacts that those substances can have on our adolescents' brains and bodies. So let me tell you a little bit about myself, just so you can trust me as a source of information about this stuff. I have been a school counselor for 16 or more years, and that's with fifth graders through college students. I've also been a private therapist, specifically with adolescents and their families, and I am a clinical addiction specialist. So this is really my jam. I've worked in treatment with adolescents and adults in various settings. And after a while, I started realizing I'd rather prevent it from happening than fix it after it had. So I've worked a lot in prevention for the last several years. So that means I'm doing drug and alcohol education at schools across Western North Carolina and beyond, as well as consulting with schools, coaching parents. And there's not letters for this to go after my name, but I'm also street certified, meaning that I've been there and done that. And my story really began in middle school. And by the time I was 19, I was in rehab with multiple addictions. I'm an author as well. I'm saying that out loud, even though I'm in the process of writing a book. It's called Raising an Addiction Proof Kid in an Addictive World, and it's going to be fire. Stay updated. And I'm a mom. I have a recent college graduate, as well as two stepkids that are 16 and 17. And they all continue to be great informants for me, as well as practice ground for the things we're going to cover this and next session. So this conversation, both session 1 and 2, really have two main intentions. One of them is that we really want to prevent our kids from taking something and taking it in a way where they hurt themselves or somebody else. But secondly is the goal of kind of long-term problem use prevention. Just like with everything else that we teach them, right, from coping skills to manners to conflict resolution skills and communication, etc. We're not teaching it to them just so that they can get a handle on it while they're on our watch and under our roof, right? We're teaching them all those things, hoping that they're going to craft these successful, thriving lives forevermore with those things. So it's the same with this information that we're talking about, is that we're hoping that they are going to develop an inner compass that will help guide them through all of the risks and temptations and pushes and pulls to use things addictively. And we're not going to see them develop problems in their 20s, 30s, or 40s, or 50s either. So I'm going to lay down some foundational bottom line concerns around this issue, as well as some rays of hope here. So for one is that we know across the board that use of things is getting younger and younger. And we have a ton of research that shows us that the younger a kid uses something, particularly repeatedly, the higher likelihood it is of them developing a problem with it. And the worse those problems tend to be, creating more devastation on their lives and being harder to recover from. The substances are also just getting hulkified, from caffeine to alcohol to cannabis. They're coming in more concentrated versions. There's devices that are getting them to the brain faster, and they're also being made increasingly like meth lab style in people's homes, just counterfeit. And all of that leads to them being more addictive and more dangerous. So use is also getting increasingly easy to conceal from us as parents and as school officials because of the forms that they're coming in and the devices that are being created to use them with, which just really feeds the potential of an addictive relationship developing. Quick brain lesson, and we're going to talk about some more in a minute, but the brain grows from the bottom to the top and the back to the front. And this frontal lobe, or the prefrontal cortex, is the last part to develop. And the burst in growth really starts around, when we talk about adolescence, around 10 or 11, and it's done by early to mid 20s. So when I say the word adolescence, that's the age I'm meaning, from about 10 to 25. But research has told us for a long time that regular use of most substance, including caffeine, during that period of ripe brain growth can do significant damage into adulthood, can disrupt the growth of that front part of the brain. In that front part of the brain, we call it the executive functioning center, right? It's like the CEO of a lot of the processes of the rest of our brain. So this is where big picture thinking happens. So the ability to think about what short or long-term consequences could be, or how one's behavior could impact other people, if it's in line with somebody's goals or in line with who a kid wants to be. If they want to get from point A to point B, what are the steps they need to do to get there? So organizing priorities and time and stuff, impulse control, emotional management, all of that is in the prefrontal cortex. So, substance use, regular or heavy during adolescence, disrupts the growth of that front part of the brain, which is crucial for life success. But newer research shows us that a kid can be abstaining most of the time and then really strap on like a binge episode of use of something, and it can do the same damage that longer term heavy use has been doing. And that's showing up into adulthood. So, legal consequences for getting arrested are heavier than kids realize. A lot of times they think, well, they'll just get their records expunged if they're under 18, and it's not that simple. So, if they get busted for transporting, selling, being under the influence, fake IDs, while their record might get quote unquote expunged, it still leaves a digital tattoo. I have watched kids lose their scholarships, college admissions, lose admission to the military because all of those folks have these intense search engines that can really dig into a kid's background. And all they do is look up somebody's name, and conversations about them or conversations that they've had online on social media can actually pop up for them. Here's the good news. Here's the ray of hope. We also have research that shows us that ongoing two-way dialogue with our kids about the risks of substances makes a huge difference. So there's a research study that studied 12 to 17-year-olds, and those who had had just one conversation with their parents about the risks of substances within the year were using 80% less than the kids who had not had that conversation with their parents. And the unfortunate part is that only 30% of those kids said that they had had those conversations. We're going to talk in part 2 all about how to do that at every age. So the reason I called this presentation Not My Kid is because of how many times I have gotten that response from parents when I've tried to open up this conversation, who are totally convinced that their kids are not at risk because they don't have any of those risk factors that seem obvious to them. But I need to tell you that just because their brains are not yet fully developed, they have jacked up stimulus seeking brains that are not yet capable of making mature decisions. They are all at risk. Our adolescents are literally wired for addiction like no other time in their lives. So their brains are kind of like that modeling clay, right? That you take it out of the package and it's really, moldable, and then it gets hardened, right? So their brains are in that malleable stage. For boys, the most absorbent their brains are around 14 years old. For girl wired brains, more around like 11 or 12. So let me break that down a little bit further. So as we talked about, right, that prefrontal cortex, that executive center, keeps them from seeing big picture, thinking about consequences, thinking about their impact on other people or on their goals or their values. And then we have the magic of dopamine. So dopamine is most often related to addiction and pleasure. And so it's the chemical in our brain that pops off when we have like a novel, new, exciting, thrilling, pleasurable experience that makes us go, yes, do that again. Dopamine pops off. So for adolescents, they actually have a dip in their dopamine levels during adolescence. That whole thrill-seeking or teen stereotype is brain-based. It's a real thing for them. They are craving excitement and new novel experiences. And then when their dopamine does pop off, when something feels good or it really works for them, it pops off extra big. So their feel-goods feel extra, extra good. And then there is this phenomenon, not really a phenomenon, it's neuroscience, of what fires wires, right? So everything that they are engaging in during this ripe stage of brain development is wiring connections between their brain cells. And what they are thinking about, focusing on, doing with their bodies, bringing their attention to, is hardwires a connection for them. And they continue to do that thing, literally paves the pathway of that neural connection. So put this all together like an equation, is that, of course, kids want to feel good. They don't want to feel uncomfortable, right? They're not necessarily thinking about what they should do with big picture thinking to feel good or have fun or numb out their discomfort. And so they do something that works and feels good, and it feels extra, extra good. And when it does, it goes cha-chunk and hardwires a connection in their brain into adulthood. And again, if they do it again, it solidifies that pathway for them. This is why we are aiming to delay their use of things as long as possible, as far into the brain development as we can, especially repeatedly. So let me just give you a little bit of background on my sources of information. So again, so that you can trust what I'm going to tell you as I get into the nitty gritty of substances. I go through some national surveys. There's several of them where they survey kids of middle school and high school age every year, every other year. Some of those I don't reference because I don't trust them as much as other ones. And then I constantly comb through research and data on a daily basis. Now, I want to let you know that I am a skeptic of that information. So when I hear a headline or a statistic or a research outcome, I really peel away the layers of that and comb through it with a fine tooth comb because I want to know, why did they research? Who did they research? Who funded it? Does anybody have an agenda there? How did they carry it out? I also have some really deep connections with our local medical and law enforcement, schools and health and human services and treatment providers that feed me regular intel on what they're seeing in trenches. And then we have a wonderful Buncombe County Partnership for Drug-Free Youth, who, among other things, does pride surveys of our Buncombe County schools kids every 2 years and holds focus groups in them. Though that data has not yet been released, they skimmed some kind of trend information off of the top for me. After working in this area for over 12 years with kids, I've got student spies everywhere that feed me intel. So let's get into these substances. So I'm just telling you, I'm going to be moving really quickly through this. I will give you my contact information at the end, and I welcome you to please hit me up for anything that you don't get that you would love to have answered. So we're going to talk about caffeine, and here's why. Our youth are being targeted by caffeine advertising like never before. And those sources of caffeine, like I said before, are these hulkified versions where sometimes there's 3 and 4 cups of coffee worth of caffeine in one of these drinks. They're targeting them, right? They're using their images, phrases, and values that talks right to them about like this general badassery, and being a rock star and daring and rebellious and extreme. So I realized a couple years ago that I needed to include this in my educational presentations when this kid, Alan Kripe, died not far away from us in South Carolina. And he had just had a weak McDonald's latte on the way into school, and then drank a Mountain Dew, and then chugged a Monster drink, walked into art class, and dropped dead. They realized that it was just a caffeine overdose. He had just had too much in too short of a time. No heart condition, nothing that existed there. I discovered that this happens way more often than we realize. There are fatalities that happen, but more often just medical emergencies that happen often with kids with heart conditions when kids are running into sports activities and they just chug a, energy drink beforehand because, again, that's how it's been marketed, right? So here's just some guidelines for how to help them learn how to be responsible about their own consumption. One of the main risks, of course, is addiction. And a lot of us know what that feels like. Before we can get our caffeine in the morning, we are in a foul mood. We can't focus. We are not alert, not awake. Sometimes there's headaches, body aches that go with withdrawal from caffeine. Not something that we want to hand our kid. It's an addiction that's been pretty normalized, but it's pretty severe. So what we know is that for us as adults, that we can have about 300 to 400 milligrams of caffeine a day before it forms an addiction and can create potential physical issues for us. For adolescents, until mid-late teens, it's about 100 milligrams of caffeine a day to develop an addiction, which is 3 sodas, half a Monster drink, about 1 cup of coffee, a little more than one of the little Red Bulls. So sleep disruption is really an issue at their age because all of that wonderful brain wiring that I was talking about happens when they're in that deep level of REM sleep at night. And so caffeine stays in the body for about 24 hours and really impacts getting that deep sleep. So we know that caffeine at any age, including us adults, worsens anxiety. They're also linking it to depression. Kids that started consuming caffeine regularly as adolescents being more likely to have depression in adulthood. More heart problems exist in kids that started with caffeine earlier. And then this is new research. It's almost like the stimulant of caffeine is like lubricating the pathways in the brain because we see that kids that started with caffeine, if they do choose to experiment with cocaine or another amphetamine, another kind of speed or upper, it makes it way more likely that they're going to get addicted to it than if they had not started with caffeine. And then energy drinks, they're just crap. I will have parents that believe that they are helping to medicate their kids' ADHD, right? Because it's a stimulant, just like other ADHD meds are. And so they're giving their kids or allowing their kids to have these energy drinks. Research has proven, hear this, it causes hyperactivity, causes inattentiveness, doesn't help it, period. So the recommendations for how to manage this healthily is about a milligram a pound of body weight up until when they hit late teens per day. Obviously avoiding before any time they're going to be amping their heart up with exercise. If they have heart issues or anxiety issues, just avoiding it altogether and then within 6 hours of bedtime. But keep in mind that sweet tea and chocolate have caffeine in them. So alcohol, not a new substance, but we've got some brand new research about it for sure. Again, we know that regular use is detrimental to the growth of the brain and can create some long-term cognitive impacts for our youth into adulthood. But we also now know that that binge drinking that is really shown off in the movies and that a bunch of us did in high school and college, that if they were to measure our brains, would find that it's left some mark. Imagine if we hadn't. So here's what is being proven is that we're seeing learning and memory deficits into adulthood that are measurable depending upon how much kids drank when they were younger and binge drinking episodes. So a reduction in the ability to adapt to unplanned situations and problem solve through them. Big one, reduction of impulse control in kids that were drinking in adolescence heavily. And then overreactive stress responses and an impaired ability to manage that stress. The good news is alcohol consumption is down. Binge use and regular use for our youth is about half of what it was 15 years ago, a little longer than that. And that's awesome. Unfortunately, there's still about 3,000 kids that are dying every year underage just from binge drinking, from drinking too much in one episode. And let me define binge as 3 or more drinks for girl bodies and 4 or more drinks for boy bodies within a 2-hour period of time. But there's some reasons why teenagers binge drink more than adults do. One of them is that they actually don't have the same sedative response. So even though alcohol is a depressant and slows down the central nervous system, consciousness, thinking, and motor functioning, as adults, a lot of us will have 1 or 2 drinks and be like ready to crash, right, and get sleepy. Is that for adolescents, they actually tend to have more of a buzz response that keeps them, drinking beyond. And they're less likely to have hangovers, which can be like kind of some natural consequence of deterrent to continuing to drink heavily. So they have done this research for decades. They will survey kids from 6th grade colleges, and they ask, how much do you think everybody is drinking? And they do this with other drugs as well. And then how much are you really using? There's this huge misperception where kids always think that their peers, especially the older ones, are doing it way more than they actually are. And of course, if that's the perception, they're more likely to start going there themselves. And then, despite what we now know from the last slide about the destruction that binge drinking can do to the brain, most high schoolers don't. And so there's this low perception of risk. Half of 12th graders did not see any great risk in binging every single weekend, which would actually be significantly detrimental to the growth of their brains. So we have Alka-Pops now too. There is now an entire rows dedicated to these Alka-Pops. And so in my day, we had those like wine coolers that were super like corn syrupy, extra sweet. And you would have to drink like 2-liter bottle to even get like a buzz, right? So now they've got twisted everything: soda, punch, lemonade, cider, to every kind of cocktail, that they make in a can. And they're often 2 and 3 times stronger than what the average beer is. They look really appealing to kids, and they're also easy to get them under radar. So the other dangerous trend here is mixing alcohol and caffeine. So that can be everything from just like throwing a shot of vodka in Red Bull, or there's a bunch of drinks that combine alcohol and caffeine now together. The danger of mixing those together, of any upper with a downer, right? So alcohol being the downer, caffeine being the upper, is that the stimulant, the upper, keeps kids from noticing that their bodies are getting dangerously intoxicated, right? And slipping into what can be unconsciousness, then coma, then death at the worst. So alcohol poisoning is way more likely when they've got caffeine giving them the illusion that they're still awake and alert and sober when their blood alcohol level is rising and rising. So we have got to talk about nicotine. We did our kids a disservice on this one. Smoking. We did a great public health wraparound campaign, and parents did this great job. Schools did this great job of talking about how awful smoking was. And the result of that was that smoking is half of what it was 10 years ago, really plummeted, especially for our youth. Unfortunately, what we failed to talk about was the risks of nicotine just in and of itself. So here comes vaping in the side door, marketed towards them, which we'll talk about in a minute. And it seems harmless, right? Because it doesn't have the tar and all those dangerous things that we talked about being in cigarettes. And so they're like, oh, cool, well, I can do this without any harm. So we got to talk about the dangers of nicotine in any form for adolescents. So, for one, nicotine is the most addictive substance on the planet. It's more addictive than crack cocaine and meth and heroin and all those scary things that we hear about being so addictive. So, the rate is actually that for a middle schooler into early high schooler, about half of kids who even pick it up and try anything with nicotine in it. Again, like with everything else, we know it disrupts the growth of that front part of the brain, of the prefrontal cortex. And so what we see is attention deficits and memory problems that are measurable. Serotonin is the other brain chemical that's important to talk about when we talk about substance impacts. So serotonin is kind of like the happy stuff. It's the chemical in our brain that's related to mood. When we feel kind of at peace and content and safe, serotonin is working as it should be. So we know that adolescent nicotine use damages serotonin production in the brain. The result of that is increased anxiety and depression, not just in those moments when the kids don't have their nicotine, which is true, but into adulthood, they're more likely to have anxiety and depression. Newer research is showing that kids who started using nicotine regularly are 10 times more likely to develop alcoholism. And it's not just because the kids that smoke or that use nicotine are more likely to drink. It looks like it's more of a change that's happening in the brain that they're kind of doing some further research on, because they're also showing some similarities happening with marijuana and kids being more likely to develop addiction to marijuana when they started with nicotine. But for anybody else that was a drunk smoker, there's actually some science that they've figured out behind that, is that people, the reason why they tend to smoke more when they drink is because nicotine actually enhances the feel-good chemicals that alcohol releases in the brain. So that combination can be particularly addictive. So we know that nicotine also weakens the immune system. Kids that are using nicotine are more likely to get sick, to get sicker, and to have a hard time getting over it. And so that's whether it's a flu or an injury or a runaway zit, they're not going to heal the same way. And then finally, that kids that started using nicotine regularly also tend to have more heart and sleep problems. So vaping, we got to break down vaping, right? Because this is the thing. So before we were talking about coronavirus, vaping was kind of the hot topic. So here's why vaping is a concern. Overall rule for all substances is that the stronger something is and the faster it goes to the brain, the more addictive it is, and the higher somebody can get, and the more impaired. And vaping brings things to the brain even faster than snorting something does, faster than taking a pill or drinking something. So at the last count, because CDC slowed down on this a little bit because they've had bigger fish to fry lately, but they had reported 68 deaths from vaping in the last year. There were more than 2,700 respiratory illnesses that resemble pneumonia, with the median age being 24 years old. So a lot of kids younger than that. And I've heard about lung transplants and really dramatic illnesses there. But be wary of, do not give your kids inaccurate information. Only about 11% of that has been from nicotine vaping. The rest of it has been from THC and cannabis vaping, which we are going to break down. But so this is where the explosion happened. So the companies came in and they advertised heavily, and particularly advertised in places that youth were seeing them and clearly targeting youth. So Juul, which of course is under serious fire right now with tons of lawsuits, which they deserve. This is their whole campaign. On the upper left here is that they had looked like they were like 16 and 17-year-olds, all cool, funky, all with like dope clothes and spiky hair and piercing. And then all of these, speaking right to their values of like freedom and attractiveness and coolness and rebellion that they unfortunately ate up. So if we're going to help our kids disassemble the distorted information that they've gotten and beliefs that they've developed around vaping, we have to first empathize with where they're at. Vaping has developed this whole culture around it. There's competitions. There are amphitheaters being filled with people that are professional vapors that are doing this really dope vape tricks while they advertise products, of course. So I encourage you to go online and look up VGods, and you will understand like this made vaping seem attractive to me when I watched these videos and saw these pictures. So there is this whole culture and community and connoisseurship that is developing around this, around understanding and choosing different devices that you get different like fat clouds from, and a ton of community online. So I encourage you to hashtag Vape Life or Vape Nation on Twitter or Instagram, and you'll see what I'm talking about. So let's break down the truth about e-cigs so we can help our kids get accurate information. So it's being called an epidemic for a good reason, because youth use has more than doubled since 2017. And we've never seen any drug in the history of tracking substance use that has had such an explosion. When they surveyed kids a couple years ago that were vaping, middle schoolers and high schoolers, only about a third of them thought that they were using nicotine products. They were just attracted to the cool flavors, right? Because they tasted like everything from Cocoa Puffs to mango. In reality, 99% of what is out there on the market contains nicotine. Again, teens tend to be uneducated on the facts. We were behind as schools and we were behind as parents on helping them get that. While vaping has proven to be helpful for a lot of people to get off of cigarettes who are already smoking heavily and potentially killing themselves with it, is, as you saw from that marketing, is that they were not marketing to 60-year-olds smoking 3 packs a day, right? They were marketing to our kids. And unfortunately, a lot of kids got started on vaping that would have never picked up a cigarette, had no interest whatsoever. They just thought it was fruity and it made them feel kind of good, but didn't see any risks in it. So unfortunately, once they get addicted, which we now know is really likely, they don't care where the nicotine comes from. And so the fact that they're putting restrictions on vapes may prevent some kids from starting. Unfortunately, it's about 1 out of 5, they're saying in any high school at any moment that is addicted right now, they are switching over to cigarettes, or they're using them at the same time so they can keep their nicotine levels up. Well, preliminary research showed that kids are 4 times more likely to start smoking cigarettes when they have begun by vaping. The bottom line on e-cigs is that there just is not any long-term research yet. They were on the market and being marketed heavily to kids before the FDA even put any regulations on them or was requiring them to release their contents. And so we have no idea what long-term use does. I mean, we're starting to see some risks with lung illnesses being created, but we don't know. We do know that there's 30 plus chemicals that are known to be carcinogens and respiratory irritants that cause lung disease. And again, we know that respiratory illnesses are happening. There's also been thousands of defective battery explosions and burns that have come out of them, and a significant amount. I mean, there's over 4,000 a year of e-liquid poisoning. And so some of that comes from youth that are just like, mango, and they're sucking down what turns out to be about 3 packs worth of nicotine, in one sitting. But the others are accidental, those e-liquids that kids get their hands on, little ones, toddlers, that end up consuming it, and it's really toxic. And so there's all of these devices, right, that are really stealth and kind of sexy and fun and cool. The thing on the top is a Juul, by the way, if you weren't aware of that, right? That just sort of looks like an extended flash drive. And even though Juul is pretty uncool now, there's 1,000 things that have been developed that look just like it, right? But even cooler. So you can have a pen that works. You can have something that looks like a key fob or an inhaler. This watch is down to $9.99 and still available online. Or you can have a vape that is the same size as a credit card. So this device on the lower left is a tank or a mod device. And so these are refillable, and that's what they get those really fat clouds and do the vape tricks off of. So the FDA did put regulations in starting in February that supposedly were supposed to restrict companies from producing products that looked like other things. Because clearly, I don't need a vape watch. I'm a grown-ass adult, and if I want to vape, I can vape. They're creating these things for kids to be able to get away with it on our watch. The other FDA restriction is companies are supposed to be communicating their ingredients. And until they communicate their ingredients and show that they're not marketing to youth, they're not supposed to get the pass of being able to be released by the FDA. Also, the flavors have all been restricted except for tobacco and menthol right now. But here's the loophole, is that those tank devices have not been included in that, and either have what the kids are calling puff bars. So there's a company called Puff Bar and a bunch of other ones that are like it, that are just like, these are little and they are stealth and they still have all these little flavors and they are disposable. So while some of those other devices, they have little pods that are refillable, they're about a pack's worth of nicotine in each one, and you use it and then you toss it. So let's talk about cannabis. So tetrahydrocannabinol, otherwise known as THC, is one of the many natural chemicals or cannabinoids in cannabis. And THC is the one that creates the high, as well as affects the brain growth and has some negative effect on adolescent brains, which we'll talk about. It is very important to be able to argue intelligently with your teenagers who want to say that, grandma was a huge raging hippie in the 70s and she smoked a ton of weed and she's just fine. Or, mom, you smoked all through high school, you told me, and you're a CEO of a company. Like, seems all good to me. Is that grandma's weed is not today's weed. In the 70s, it was about 2%, my day about 4%, and now the average street herb weed that the kids can usually get their hands on is about 20. And that's here in my non-legal state of North Carolina. So those of you that are in Colorado or California, where it is being grown and sold at much higher, like 30+%. I want to get a little note to the meme on the side, because we're going to talk extensively about this in part 2, about how the messages that kids are getting from different directions that normalize drug use, right, and desensitize them to it. I can laugh at this, but for kids, they are just soaking in this message that it is normal to get stoned AF. So dab wax, also known as BHO or butane honey oil, can be called shatter butter, is a marijuana concentrate. So a lot of us are familiar with hash, which was a concentrate extracted from the buds of plants. Is that this is another extraction process. Whereas we talked about how herb weed can be 20% THC, dab wax is 50 to 90% THC. And so about a rice-sized amount of this is heated up, is usually like a dose, and there's various heating elements used, and I'll show you that in a minute. And then it's vaporized. A lot of youth are starting with this now. And while the research that I'm going to share with you on how it negatively impacts the teenage brain is on like 15% from a few years ago, 15 to 20% herb weed, it is not on this stuff. So there's no research yet on what's slamming the growing adolescent brain with 50 to 90% THC is doing to it. But I have some theories, and I don't think it's going to look good. But this isn't something that kids are educated, even in our school programs, about. So these are some of the devices that are used to dab with. So Snoop's got a whole line, and some of these devices are extra stealth. They're really like thin and small and pen-like. Again, you can have functioning pens, or some of these little devices. The heating element that you see with the little blowtorch that's an official rig. So those are more expensive for the more serious dabber. If your kid's got a little blowtorch on their nightstand, they're probably not developing a flambe hobby. You need to ask some questions. So Amazon, as of 2 years ago, were selling Juuls and all the Juul pods and selling all of these vaping devices and the nicotine. They have stopped doing that, but they are still providing accessories to make it more attractive and make it easier. For example, these like wraps personalize your dab pen, so it's particularly funky and cool. So a lot of the vaping devices require a liquid. And so liquid THC is being manufactured and coming from legal states, but it's also not hard to make. And that can be up to 70% THC, also extra strong compared to herb marijuana. And we've got edibles. And of course, it's not new to throw some herb marijuana into some cookies or some brownies. But again, it's getting stronger and stronger. And there's all of these things coming out of our legal states, from chocolate to candies, right, of all kinds. And kids are figuring out how to also make them themselves. But I need to point out that like one of these gummy bears is about the strength of about a half a bowl of your average weed, for any of you who are familiar with such measures, and who has one gummy bear, right? So the problem that we're seeing with edibles is that these are leading to toxic overdose increasingly because kids, of course, will just eat and eat something delicious, but because it's really easy to overconsume what can be high levels of THC without them realizing it. And I have dealt with plenty of situations locally where kids have gotten like pranked by somebody giving them candy which had THC in it and they didn't realize it, or by buying something that was laced and them getting dangerously high and having some really negative consequences that they were not prepared for. So here's what research tells us about marijuana and the adolescent brain. So for one, it's important to know for all ages, we are starting to see overdoses in a way that never existed before. And what overdose looks like is from unconsciousness to dangerous levels of vomiting and psychosis. So kids losing touch with not knowing who they are, what's going on, what's real. There's an argument forever about whether marijuana is addictive, and a lot of kids will say that it's not. Because they've heard that narrative. But the argument was, is it psychologically versus physically addicting? So it is without argument psychologically addicting, right? The same way that video gaming or eating disorders or porn, any of those things that pop off brain chemicals in a certain way can become addictive. And people can damage their lives and their health over those addictions. So they can still be severe, but cannabis wasn't causing physical addiction in the way that somebody would have withdrawal, like alcohol or opioids. This is changing because of how strong it's getting. My colleagues that are working in treatment, particularly in Colorado, California, they're starting to argue, the medical community is arguing that this is becoming physically addictive because we're seeing withdrawal like we never have before from marijuana. So body temperatures dropping, insomnia, appetite changes, extreme dangerous vomiting and nausea. So the brain functioning piece, again, so disruption to the growth of the front part of the brain in some really obvious ways. So with adolescents who start using regularly, what I've seen as a treatment provider is emotional management damage. So inability to control impulses. So that big picture thinking, which somebody really loses when they're under the influence of cannabis, right? They get hyper focused. Is that when adolescents are using, it seems to make some changes in the brain that disrupt the ability to have big picture thinking into adulthood. So unfortunately, kids that have anxiety and depression are more likely to use, and they're also more likely to get addicted to it. But it creates this illusion that while they're using, they don't feel as anxious, or while they're using, they don't feel depressed. So they think that it's working. And they're watching it be prescribed with success for some people with bipolar or with anxiety that are adults with fully formed brains and bodies in medicinal states. Unfortunately, it is totally different for adolescents. And so we're seeing very, very clear repeated research that shows that adolescent regular heavy cannabis users are that their depression, their anxiety is way more likely to be exacerbated and be worse into adulthood. And then motivation and persistence. So there is this stereotype of the stoner that just sits and plays Worlds of Warcraft all day and eats Cheetos and is just baked as hell, right? There's some science behind that. Amotivational syndrome has been proven scientifically that people of all ages who use regularly lose motivation, lose goal directedness. The big thing around this is that when we're talking to our adolescents, it's just about, yes, all of this stuff may be true in terms of some research that they're showing with fully formed brains and bodies. You're not going to argue any of that in terms of the medicinal benefits that they're seeing or mental health benefits that are being proven, but that for adolescents, it is completely and totally different. So this is an image that is powerful because it shows it instead of just talking about it. This was a 16-year-old who was actually not under the influence at the time, or he hadn't gotten, high in the last several hours. And they were showing brain activity. They're putting this kid through tasks that involved memory and impulse control. So if you take my brain and go like this, right? The front part of the brain is where those two holes are, right in the top. And this is showing the parts of the brain that were not firing where they should have been. So these are what kids have really got sick off of and died off of, are what they call carts, short for cartridges. And these are the super fun looking ones that are clearly, again, not marketed towards 50-year-olds, but marketed towards kids. And they have candy carts, that mimic popular candies, cereal carts, and dank vapes, which was a company that was taken over the scene. But these are often being made bootleg. People can buy the packaging and then make stuff out of their home. And so it is important for kids to know that if it is cheap and if it is extra fun and it didn't come out of some regulated store and device, then it's particularly shady. So this is important to notice. This is new information to me recently, is that we had several cases this year of kids that required emergency medical attention during the school day because there were opioids in their vapes. So this is going to be something that I think is going to be an uptrend, unfortunately, is that anything that can be liquefied, right, that can be melted down. And so opioids, meth or cocaine or prescription drugs, if it can be put in a vape, then it can be vape. Again, they're making it easier for kids to kind of get away with this on our watch to their detriment. So again, Amazon, no longer selling devices, but they do sell this stuff by this company called Human Friendly that makes everything from household objects like brushes to every kind of bottle, from water bottles to soda bottles and cans, that are actually drug storage devices that have pouches that go with them that are odor blockers, so they can get by the drug dogs or get by the drug dog parents. Then there are these little air purifiers that you can buy for about $6 that kids can throw in their backpack and just use in the bathroom at school, that sucks up their vape or their smoke. Stuff to stick things in the back of their phone. And then these little lower right devices, they're not even trying to fake it on Amazon as dab storage units. So you can have cool, fun, personalized things to put your highly concentrated, highly addictive, brain damaging form of cannabis in, if you want it to just look like lip balm instead. The upper left is a sploof, which is nothing new. Just throwing a sock or throwing some laundry sheets into a toilet paper roll and breathing into it is, one way to get it by us as parents. So prescription meds have gotten a lot of press over the last several years. And the good news is that prescription drug overdoses have decreased a little bit over the last couple of years. But if it's your kid that overdoses or has some kind of tragedy, it doesn't matter where they are on that curve, right? And those are absolutely still happening, often, unfortunately, with first time or rare use. So there's three categories of prescription drugs that are being abused the most amongst our youth: stimulants, sedatives, and opiates. So stimulants are the drugs that are typically prescribed for ADHD. So Ritalin, Vyvanse, Adderall, probably being the most popular to abuse. And the way they're being abused is as quote unquote study drugs, and they're referenced that way. And they're kind of referred to almost like no-dose was, in the 80s and 90s. And these are often not the kids that we, think of as like the druggy kids. They're not doing other drugs. They're high achievers. They're the perfectionists, the straight A students, the ones with tons of activities going on. And they're just wanting to stay up and rock those projects. The problem is when somebody is not diagnosed with ADHD or ADD and they're not being monitored by a doctor, not being prescribed, is that it can lead to heart problems if there is steady use of them, or trip a heart problem that a kid didn't know they had. Increasing blood pressure, seizures have happened. OCD, like obsessive compulsive stuff, starts to develop if somebody is using these with some regularity, as well as anxiety spiking if a kid already has anxiety, but then even being created. The most important thing to argue is letting them know that the research has shown it does not create an advantage in terms of their academic performance. And they've studied this a few different ways. So the sedatives tend to be the benzodiazepines or benzos that are prescribed for anxiety, as well as meds that are prescribed for sleep. So Xanax is probably the most popular. So Xannies, Xans, they call them bars because they come in these bars that can be separated out into different doses. Klonopins, known as K-pins, Valium, Ativan, and then Ambien and Lunesta as sleep meds, and other ones that I haven't listed. One of my local informants who works for Health and Human Services, when I said, okay, well, what do I need to let parents know? This was a quote from her. She wanted to make sure that I told you that benzos are up and coming and that the addiction is severe. So benzos act like alcohol. They're central nervous system depressants. So they slow down every function of the body, along with those thoughts. Somebody is anxious. The addiction acts like alcohol too, is that it actually, when somebody is addicted to a benzo, coming off of it can be medically dangerous. So we need to be talking about these as much as opioids. They have not gotten as much press, but Xanax overdoses are also very high. So you have to be living under a rock to not have heard about the opioid crisis. And for a while there, we were putting a lot of resources and media attention on it before everybody started talking about vaping. And you would think that it had all gone away since we haven't heard about it much. But unfortunately, even though the overdose rates have gone down a little bit in the past year, they're still tragically high. So opiates are everything that is in the painkiller category, including heroin, things that are made from oxycodone, so oxycontin, which the kids and music references will call oxys. Roxys are short for roxycodone, which is the generic version of oxycodone. Percocets are perks. And then codeine, Vicodin, morphine. There's a bunch of other things that fall into that category. I'm not going to get into the nitty gritty numbers of this, but I wanted you to just see the visual of what overdose rates have looked like over the past 20 years. As you can see, there has been a pretty steady incline in pretty much all of these substances. And if alcohol were in here, we'd see alcohol as well. The yellow line is the one I'm bringing attention to because that is fentanyl, which is a synthetic opioid that started to find its way into everything just a couple years ago, kind of by surprise. The other ones to notice here are heroin, the green line, which started to skyrocket around 2011. And then in the last couple of years, while other things are ticking down a little bit, we've started to see cocaine and meth starting to rise, which we'll talk about in a minute. In my county, in Buncombe County, we've seen overdose deaths and ER visits triple since 2015. And unfortunately, a quarter of those are young people. They're under 25. So we're going to talk about heroin and fentanyl because these are two things that we have seen skyrocketing overdose and that hit us by surprise and that are popping up in unexpected places. I started to have my colleagues in well-known colleges around the country and locally being shocked that their students were developing heroin addictions, including shooting it up. And these were intelligent, educated, often well-off kids that were using heroin, which had previously been thought of as just like a gutter drug that people use when they've tapped out on every other kind of drug. And it's important to know that about 80% of heroin addicts started with prescription meds. So needing to amp up that high, keep amping it up as they developed a tolerance, especially as it got harder to get prescription drugs because of the restrictions, because of the overdoses, is that people kind of switched over to heroin, which the dealers knew to release and to make cheap just when the supplies of prescription drugs got limited. And then fentanyl started to show up in things. And fentanyl has been a prescription drug for a long time for, persistent, severe pain. But it was starting to be made in other countries, in Mexico and China mostly, and getting in and cheaper than heroin and cheaper than a lot of other drugs. So it started to pop up in anything that was in powdered form. So cocaine and meth are being increasingly laced with fentanyl, which is part of why those overdoses are skyrocketing. But heroin has fentanyl in it. And fentanyl is, particularly this counterfeit fentanyl coming from other places, is about 100 times stronger than morphine or 50 times stronger than the average heroin. And this picture is a typical deadly dose of heroin compared to what a deadly dose of fentanyl looks like. So it's extraordinarily strong. And we know in my county, at last count, about 85% of all overdose deaths included fentanyl. So why prescription drugs have gained in popularity as substances of abuse for adolescents is not rocket science. They, for one, have this whole illusion of safety around them. The kids will tell me they're prescribed by doctors. They're FDA approved, right? They're made by people in white coats and people take them all the time without any problem. So how can just popping one or two be a big deal? They're not like those druggy drugs. They've taken pills for as long as they can remember, from Flintstone vitamins to ibuprofen. It's not like they're like shooting something or smoking something or snorting something, which would be really druggy stuff, right? The music references right now are at an all-time high, and some of the most popular music has the most references than ever before that really normalizes and romanticizes prescription drugs. So Xans and Perc are common references. They're also super easy to acquire and transport and pass around. So the majority of kids report that they get them from their own medicine cabinets or their parents or from their friends who got them from those sources or buying meds off of each other. If somebody gets prescribed a painkiller or an ADHD med, those are really hot commodity. And the adults just tend to be uninformed. I need to say a word too about the transport of them as I see kids that are making deals on like Snapchat. So now they can plan a drug deal by just throwing a post out that materializes within 24 hours. And they just say like, hey, went to grandma's house, got some stuff. Meet you at the lockers at 2 o'clock on the north wing. 2 o'clock comes around and 15 drug deals can go down in about 10 seconds. There's some really dangerous trends going on, again, that kids tend to be uninformed of. And this is where these first time tragedies come from. So mixing things together is where a lot of this happens. And often it's with alcohol. So when you've got a downer, for example, that is a central nervous system depressant, so it slows down breathing, slows down heart rate, slows down consciousness. So that could be a painkiller or any of the benzos that we talked about, and mixing that with another one. And again, it's often alcohol. Kids will be at a party and they're already, having a drink or two. And then they're like, well, I'm just going to pop this one pill. How bad can it be? And unfortunately, 2 + 2 doesn't equal 4. 2 + 2 equals 6 or 8. And those things together shut the body down. And we already talked about when an upper and a downer, how that can be dangerous to put those together. Let me tell you a quick story that really struck me. So there was a family, I think in Ohio, that Savage family, who were that suburban family, that were playing sports and doing well in school. And the two boys went off to a graduation party and they had had a couple drinks and then decided to pop one oxy, came home by curfew, made a sandwich and had a conversation with their mom and went to bed. And then she woke up to both of her sons being dead because by the time it had all hit their system, it shut everything down. Kids don't realize that some of these medications are a day's worth of med and they're designed to be slow release. They take them on top of each other when they don't get like a woo, I'm so high feeling. And by the time they both hit their system again, right, it shuts things down. Again, when they don't get this instant high that they think they're going to get from taking a drug, we'll crush up and snort it so it'll go to the brain even faster. Of course, that is just a recipe for overdose because they're not designed to hit the body that way, right? That's not how they're FDA approved. And then taking others' prescription drugs where they are being monitored by a doctor and not knowing how it's going to impact your own body. So we had a kid here in Chapel Hill that came home from winning the championship game. He was a football player, senior, and was all achy. He's at his grandma's house. He goes into the medicine cabinet. She's got methadone there that she's been prescribed for pain for over a decade, and looks at the bottle and it says, take 1 or 2 as directed for every 4 hours for pain, right? So he's like, well, I'm super achy, so I'm going to take 2. And his 145-pound, no tolerance body, he died from that. Whereas, grandma was about twice his size and had tolerance to it. Now, this is becoming a huge increasing risk is the amount of counterfeit pills that are being made and what's ending up in them. So I need to show you this scary slide. So this was stuff that I just found within about 10 minutes on eBay. And there's plenty of other websites now where you can get this stuff. With about $300 in my pocket, I could buy a pill press, these molds and the fillers and everything I needed to have a counterfeit pill business at home, including making fake Xanax. And so they have these that look like Percocets and Oxycontin, and they end up with God knows what in them. But lately it has been fentanyl. We've had celebrity deaths from getting tainted counterfeit meds. Prince died from a Vicodin, what he thought was a Vicodin that looked just like a Vicodin. And this is a celebrity with all the money in the world, right? And all the resources in the world, had a bottle full of Vicodin that was laced with fentanyl. Demi Lovato's overdose last summer was from something laced. Lil Peep was a rapper that died last fall who his Xanax was laced with fentanyl. Tom Petty laced with fentanyl. All accidental deaths. So if it can happen to them, it can absolutely happen to your kid. So over-the-counter medicines, there's some of them that are abusable and really easy for them to get their hands on, and they can be deadly and they can be addictive. Cough and cold meds here are some of the biggest perpetrators of this. Coricidins are also known as triple C's or Skittles, and cough syrup. So lean, scissor, purple drink started as a hip hop thing. And unfortunately, the guy who actually created this died of an overdose of it. But it was a prescription cough syrup mixed with lemon lime soda and some Jolly Ranchers thrown in for pizzazz. Again, he overdosed, his protege overdosed, and so many other people overdosed that they stopped making that cough syrup. Now, codeine cough syrup is an extra bonus, but typically when they talk about lean, it is often just any cough and cold liquid medicine mixed with soda and the Jolly Ranchers or sometimes Skittles. Problem with this, so dextromethorphan, otherwise known as DXM, and they'll call it dexing or robotripping, is that there's all of this other stuff in those medicine that is even more dangerous, like acetaminophen, that at high levels can be extremely toxic to the body. Other than the fact that dextromethorphan, DXM itself, can create addiction. I have treated several Coracetin addicts at this point. So it acts like PCP on the system. It causes like a distortion of space and slows things down. It can cause organ damage, heart issues, respiratory issues, and I have dealt with some deaths as well as the people that use this perpetually also developing what I've seen, PCP addicts develop, which is like a volatility and anger, a whole change in their behavior. And then Benadryl and Advil are a different substance, but also abusable and also overdose risk. I mean, one Benadryl knocks my ass out. So I don't know why you'd want to take more of those. But we locally had to respond to some overdose issues with middle schoolers and high schoolers on these substances. So the bottom line of kind of safeguarding your household and your kids from these is to just know what's in the house, know what's abusable, keep an inventory of it. When it comes to medications, don't put it in your kids' hands to monitor their own meds if they are taking abusable things like an anti-anxiety med or an ADHD med or a painkiller, is that it's tempting. But my kid was getting harassed as soon as people knew that he was on ADHD meds. And then making sure that everybody, everywhere that your kids go, if they're going to grandma's, if they're going to aunts and uncles' houses, that they know to do the same thing. If you have a prescription for something abusable in larger quantities, that you might want to consider getting a lockbox. So it's important for you to know too that if your doctor, even though they have gotten more and more, hesitant to prescribe opioids to kids, which is great, that if they do, to ask some questions about it if it's necessary, because research has shown that an ibuprofen and acetaminophen or two ibuprofen and acetaminophen are as effective as morphine, oxy, and Vicodin for sudden and severe pain. Narcan or naloxone, locally, all the middle and high schools had trainings and received a supply of Narcan. More frequently, gas station employees and librarians and community members have gotten stocked on and trainings on these because it is a reversal of opioids and can prevent somebody from fatally overdosing. In our community alone, while we had close to 90 overdoses last year from opioids, between EMTs and community members, just what's been reported, there was close to 1,300 reversals, Narcan administrations that saved most of those people's lives that would have otherwise been fatal. So I would encourage you to supply your teenager with Narcan. And so you can get it without a prescription at most of the drugstores. If you have insurance, it's cheap, it's like $10 or under. If you don't, you do have to look for a community agency that is giving it out, because otherwise it's about $120 plus for one of them. So hallucinogens we need to talk about just because there's a lot of fascination around them and there's new risks with them. LSD is the one that is more of the danger right now. Mushrooms haven't changed a lot. Peyote hasn't changed a lot. It's harder to get your hands on. So the risks around LSD that we now know is that, for one, like everything else, it is being made meth lab style in people's homes. So it is getting a bunch of crap in it, unpredictable stuff in it. And so for the first time in history, people are having deadly overdoses from acid. They couldn't kill rats if they tried in the past, right? It was something like 50,000 hits of acid or something before a rat would die. But that's not the case anymore. And they have shown that for adolescents that have extended or heavy use of hallucinogens, and this does include other hallucinogens like mushrooms and peyote or ketamine, that they're more likely to experience anxiety and depression and paranoia, and flashbacks, particularly kind of disturbing ones, are more likely to happen, they've shown, with adolescent users. And HPPD, which is a real thing, it is not common. I myself know of 6 people that have never quite come back from their trip and are either still institutionalized or have partial hospitalization because they have hallucinogenic persisting perception disorder. And that is more likely to happen with adolescent users, particularly if there is psychosis in the family. We've got to end on talking about cocaine and meth because, as I mentioned before, the overdose rates are escalating fast. And this is particularly dangerous for youth because cocaine and meth are particularly addictive for teens. This has to do with the way that they extra focus on and explode dopamine, and dopamine for them is extra reactive and in a natural deficit, right? So the other piece of why it's super dangerous is again because it is being mixed with fentanyl increasingly. So overdose deaths have tripled nationally in the last 5 years from cocaine and from meth. What is made in meth labs is just out of a bunch of toxic poisons. And so one way to really talk about this with your kids is I encourage watch a Faces of Meth video. Just Google that on YouTube. They have a sea of pictures of people often that started out attractive or started out looking like soccer moms or the kid next door. And it's showing how meth, like no other substance I've ever seen, destroys the brain and mental health and destroys, like literally just ages and rots the body. And you watch it happen. And the user cannot see that it's happening to themselves because of what it's doing to their brain. I like to show them ones of young people. The one on the upper left was a mother put this virally online, and this was only after 7 months of use. And the woman in the middle was on America's Next Top Model, and she got clean, but then passed away because she had already done too much damage. So Molly is just ecstasy, what came out when I was in college. And then soon thereafter, they started to show significant damage to pleasure centers in the brain. So it kind of backed off for a while because people got scared of it. So the brilliant drug dealers decided to just rebrand it and make it sound like the girl next door. How less harmful could it sound, right? Along with this marketing message that it was purer. So MDMA is the substance that people are expecting when they take ecstasy or Molly. And in its pure form, MDMA, and this is in its lab quality, thousands of dollars pure form, it's pretty readily absorbed by the body, right? Not shown to be harmful. That is not even close to what they can get their hands on or what's on the street. About 13% of what has been seized has been found to even have any MDMA in it. And then a bunch of other crap. So it is not pure. And what they are showing is that even fairly rare use. So some of the studies I saw had people that had used 5, 6 times a year having visible scarring to their brain, as well as memory and processing problems. The big thing that happens here, because it acts so much on serotonin, is depression with kids that are using. So this tends to be one of those that kids don't realize is so harmful, and parents often don't realize. They'll make jokes about sniffing glue. I talked to a really great model mom who had been with her kids were sucking the gas out of the whipped cream can, not the whipped cream, but the gas out of it, not realizing that is straight up brain cell killing. Again, these are just chemicals. And unfortunately, the higher users are our younger kids because they can just get them anywhere. And so if you see chemicals in your kids' room, smell chemicals, see soaked rags, they'll put them sometimes in bags or in jars or something so that they can sniff them or sniff them directly. Computer duster is one of those that I have watched some deaths and some tragedies happen with. I worked with a kid who was huffing computer duster for just a couple months, and he developed a twitch in his eye and was dragging his right leg a little bit, almost as if he'd had a stroke, and had ringing in his ears, and none of that is expected to go away. So these will destroy organs, will eat away the lining on brain cells so that messages can't get through the brain. It's just one of the worst things that kids can do. And unfortunately, there's something called sudden sniffing death. And that 1 out of 4 of those that are usually kids who die, it was the first time they ever touched it because it literally takes over the oxygen and they die from asphyxiation. So that is the end. I know that is so much intense and heavy and really terrifying information. What I want you to hold on to is the hope and the reminder that we do have a lot of power to influence our kids and help them steer through this stuff. And so I really encourage you to plug into part 2. All of this information isn't really valuable if we don't know how to have open, honest dialogue with our kids about it that they're going to trust. So, how to have those conversations, how to help them be peer pressure resistant, how to help them disassemble all of these pro use messages they're soaking in, as well as how do we respond artfully if we catch our kids using something, which most kids will by the time they're out of high school, do something at least once. So we're going to talk about all of that next time. But meanwhile, here's some main ways to plug in to stay on top of this information. On my website, on the parent resources section, I have combed through and they're the best of the best sources so you can stay on top of them. The Partnership for Drug-Free Kids is an amazing one-stop place to get everything you need, from drug information to how to have conversations, to how to get treatment, to how to cope as a parent with a kid's use. It's all on there. And they have a great newsletter where I get a ton of information if you sign on for that. They also have an app that you can get on your phone. So I've got a bunch of social media that I keep live with how to raise our kids healthily towards and through adolescence. So I've got a Twitter, an Instagram, and a Facebook that are all at Kriya Counselor. And then I have a YouTube channel that I encourage you to check out. Plug in my name and you'll see it. So thank you for taking this hour. Take a deep breath. You got this. See you next time.